Hello, everyone. Those in attendance, we will give the attendees a couple more minutes to get their Zooms in order, and then we will begin the formal part of the program. In the meantime, I want to welcome all of you. For those of you who want to see all of the speakers attending, you can put it on gallery view. For most of you are probably far more familiar with Zoom than I am. You can put it on gallery view and you'll be able to see all of us, or otherwise you'll just see the speakers who are here. Most of our speakers are in attendance. We have one speaker, unfortunately, who will join us via video. She could not make the presentation, but sends you all her greetings, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So we'll give us a minute and then we will begin.
Hi, Karan.
Hi, Karan.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I didn't know there's a separate link for the panelists. I was waiting at a 9:30 room.
You look good, Karen. Don't worry.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Oh, long time no see. I like your background.
Well, it's all the chancellors previously in Germany. So maybe one day.
Yeah. Wow.
And for those participants who are watching, you can enjoy the banter and chit chat of the groups of participants, and it is kind of fun. All right, and with that, I think we are just about ready to begin. There are quite a number of you here, and I want to thank you all for taking the time out, not just our participants, but for those of you who are taking the time out today to join us in this conference roundtable, and I hope it will provide you with something interesting that you can mull over. Certainly no answers, but perhaps a lot of new perspectives. And with that, I want to take a moment now to formally welcome everyone to the Coronavirus and International Affairs webinar conference roundtable. Why give an event one name when you can give it 3 names, which is normally what lawyers tend to do, and it's a bad habit, but there you go. Welcome. I will take a moment to introduce the conference and set the stage. And after that, we will divide the materials. There's a wealth of materials, as you can imagine, and all globally contextual. We will begin, after my very short introduction, by focusing on Asia and particularly on China, where we have a distinguished group of academics, researchers, and global society folks who will provide us with their insights. We will then have a period of engagement, and then we will shift our gaze from Asia to the rest of the world, with a focus on Europe, from Spain to some of the republics of the former Soviet Union and Israel, and then to North America, which includes not just the United States, but we'll be looking at North America and the Caribbean region as well. So welcome all. And I will take a moment now to set the stage for you, and then we will move on. The emergence of a new strain of coronavirus, COVID-19, one of a more lethal strain of a class of virus that cause disease in humans, has had a profound effect on virtually all aspects of human activity. And that has certainly become common knowledge now, not so much when we organized this at the end of February. As of today, and I went and looked at the numbers this morning, as of today, confirmed cases, and most of these numbers, of course, undercount and probably significantly undercount. Worldwide, we've got 2,165,500 confirmed cases, 550,000 of which have been counted as recovered, and 145,705 deaths. Those will surely increase between now and what will eventually be deemed to be the end of this wave of pandemic. These deaths have been reported in virtually every country on Earth, but even these numbers, as I've suggested, are contested, and they serve not just the purpose of medicine and the purposes of statisticians, but they increasingly appear to serve the purposes of politicians, theorists, and the like. And to that extent, numbers become important, although they become problematic. Now, for the same, the pandemic at the same time not only appears in every corner of the world, but the medical and health implications are even more significant and long-lasting, and they remain as contested as the numbers are themselves. We probably know more about what little we know about COVID-19 than we actually know about it. Hopefully that will change quickly, but certainly the situation now is somewhat problematic. And while the medical and health implications are significant and long-lasting, and profoundly tragic, the effects of the disease on governance, on law, and international affairs will likely be even more significant and long-lasting. As states, institutions, and individuals respond to the challenges, always in a contextually unique way, all of the structures of the contemporary world have come under stress, and principally the structures and normative frameworks of globalization. These include everything from the free movement of investment, capital, and goods to migration. The international ramifications have also stressed the constitutional orders of many states, as the needs of responses sometimes might threaten domestic and international constitutional orders and principles. At the same time, COVID-19 has opened a path to a revolution in the use of data governance, of big data, of artificial intelligence in the management of society and in the construction of collective responses to pandemic. In this dynamic context, the COVID-19 epidemic has brought out both the best and the worst of individuals and human societies, as periods of crisis tend to do. Those best and worst impulses may eventually embed themselves into the patterns of behaviors and as they will be expressed in law, in policy, or in cultural bias. The impulses are brought to a climax, and as we've seen, at least in this current stage, have been brought to a climax as borders are sealed, as transport is severely constrained, and as the constant focus on pandemic creates the sort of stress on individuals with respect to jobs, mobility, sickness, and the like, that can produce suicide, madness, and other psychological difficulties at the human level. This is not just an institutional crisis, but it is a very personal and individual crisis as well, which centers on the disease itself, but then on all of the all of the ramifications around it. It is in this context that we thought it useful to bring together a group of leading scholars, researchers, and practitioners from all over the world to talk about some of these themes as they have been evolving over the course of the last year. When we originally organized the conference, the notion of pandemic and its scope was far, far less global and far, far less significant than we would have thought possible. A lot has changed since the early part of February when we began talking about this and the middle and end of April. And that will also be part of our discussion. This is one of the most fast-moving, world-changing at every level of human organization crises that we have seen in a long, long time. And it is with that, and with that in mind, that we were thinking about the crisis and the way in which the world may or may not be changing or responding. And in that context, and I'll end with this, we have a number of organizing questions that we thought would be useful. Now, our speakers will speak about the things that have changed, of course, since we organized this and what's important, but these can be used as a kind of set of framing questions around which we'll have discussion. One of them is perceptions and misperceptions about the situation in China and its connections to the rest of the world. Another is the use of coronavirus as a veil for racism or ethnocentrism or other forms of actions which prior to the pandemic would have been condemned. We will think about issues of national responses to perceptions of crisis as well as to the reality of crisis and whether in fact there's a difference between the two. The effects of coronavirus on the movement of people, investment, and capital across borders, and that has certainly changed significantly, as well as the consequences of coronavirus for the state of international affairs and legal structures. And here we talk about quarantines and in a way that's very personal to us, its effect on the provision of education and educational services, supply and production chain. Oh, thank you. A shout out to Bethany Salgado for a very nice interview yesterday on global production and production chains and corporate responsibility. Human rights versus collective responsibilities and the way in which those are framed. The repercussions for big global trade projects with specific reference to what had been at the center of global economic discussion before COVID-19, and that is the evolution and development of the Belt and Road Initiative from China's side and the America First Initiative from the US side. And lastly, the effects ultimately on education and other service industries. We had been a world that had been growing together, closer together physically. And we now find ourselves in the shadow of a pandemic where indeed physical proximity becomes deadly or at least far more risky. That disjunction between where we had been moving over the course of 200 years in terms of physical and psychological closeness and the realities of a pandemic that may be pushing us further apart may also have collateral effects. And so with this in mind, I think I've done more than enough to frame this. I would love now to turn to our speakers who will be focusing for the next little bit of time on China. Rather than spend another 20 minutes introducing them, their introductions, in fact, would take the next 3 hours. I will allow each of the speakers to briefly introduce themselves. They will each speak just to produce a statement, a kind of organizing statement for their interventions, 5, maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and dialogue and other discussions. To the extent that our participants have questions, we've posted questions to the conference website, which you're welcome to look at, and our conference participants have seen them, and they may their responses may reflect approaches to answers. If conference participants have other questions that they have in mind, please post them to the chat part of this on the program. I've been asked to display on a split screen the program with the speakers, and I will move forward on that. And thank you for the suggestion. I will try to get that up on the screen as we begin talking. So please be patient on that score, and I will put it up. And so they will introduce themselves, and then we will move forward. With that introduction, let me start with the first of our speakers, Professor Sun Ping.
Just introduce myself, right?
Yes.
I'm a assistant professor at East China University of Political Science and Law. I'm in Shanghai. I'm interested in constitutional law. Hi, everyone.
All right, it's all yours.
5 minutes.
You mean keep
Yeah.
talking?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
sorry,
Yeah.
I saw we introduced ourselves first. So okay. Thank you, Larry. Thank you for having me here. This wonderful talking. Okay. Let me talk about the current situation in China right now. And as you may know, there's no more any secrets in China for the whole world. Every detail happen in China, it will post it on every newspapers all over the world. So I think the what's already happened to everybody already know. For me personally, um, um, in the middle of the spring, that's another city, Nanchang in the Jiangxi province. So after the Spring Festival, I already bought the train ticket, the speed train ticket. So I decided to travel as I planned. But my mother, and my family, my big family, disagree with it, and we fought for that. But finally, and then my family, my wife, me, and my son, you know, like go to a war zone and with face mask and gloves, and even we cover everything in the speed train. That's really horrible. But I have to say, right now, uh, I live in Shanghai in China. Everything recovered, and on the street there are more and more people, and but still a little bit far from full recovery. I think there will be two things which will decide if everything back to normal. One is the re, the reopening of the schools, and the good news is that I think in Shanghai, uh, at the first or second week of May, all schools will be opened, at least universities. And also the second thing we're looking for is when the National People's Congress will, which is supposed to be held at I think it should be March. So we will see. Uh, and so when the situation getting better and better in China, in Shanghai, I think we normal people, especially our scholars, we care about three things. One, the first one is that there's still some uncertainty about virus, about COVID-19, which means there's still lots of scientific area keep unknown for people, which also caused a lot of worries about if the virus will come again, the pandemic will come again. So that's what we people worried first. And the second thing we is how to learn the lessons.
Oh, we're losing you. Soon. Oh,
The secondary fact. Sorry.
oh, we lost you there for a little bit. Could you? We lost you for about a minute. Might you
Oh,
be
sorry.
able to?
It could be the internet. Okay, let me repeat. Right now we normal people focus on care about three things. One is the scientific areas of the virus, how it trans uh, the second thing from the pandemic in China, who make mistakes? Who gonna take the responsibility? The local government or the CDC in Beijing? And the third thing is that how to deal with the secondary consequences from the pandemic, which include lots of things, especially focus on economic area sector, because everybody talking about there will be economic crisis follow the pandemic. So and my personally, I care about those people who need help, just like Gaoshan asked Nicholas, if how the government will help those poor people or those private companies owners. Lots of people were broke up, so how we help them. And this is the situation right now in China. So my second point is that I will talk about my opinions about the pandemic, especially the effects on the global. I think DDoS attack, computer virus attack, which means launch large amount of requests on certain service in a very short time and consume all the resources in a short time, and then until the whole system, the service shut down. I think at first I heard somebody talk about this DDoS attack on medical system, but actually it's not only attack on medical system, it is attack on all systems. It's attack on government, on global order system, on China-US relations. So it's attack on everything. I think, and the result is weird. The weird is that in the global relations is that it turns out to be a weird competition. It's a competition of to see who is the worst. I mean, between among different governments, which means the winner will be the last worst. So it's kind of a weird situation right now in global, which means like U.S. will criticize China, China will criticize U.S., or U.S. will criticize Europe, or China will criticize Europe. The result is the second is too soon. It might be too soon for the pandemic. I rather or the it's kind of a thing to for example, the conflicts between U.S. and China. As you may know, before the pandemic, we just talk about economic conflicts. But right now, we're talking about decoupling, like the questions I proposed. Even I read lots of newspapers and lots of scholars talking about to isolate China from the global. More and more people talk about it. More and more political figures in the U.S. Consider it seriously. Congressman, president, and this is one thing. This is one example, which I said, after the pandemic, every trend exists will accelerate. And the second example is the data-driven society. As you may know, because we have to stay home, so the only thing we rely on is internet. We, especially those area before pandemic, less uh, people are often, for example, education online, a phenomenon globally. So, so totally pessimistic, but I hope I'm wrong. So that's my opinion. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Larry.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much. That was actually quite enlightening. We can move on to our next speaker, Miao Shangdai.
All right. Thank you, Professor Becker. Thank you, Alice, and thank you all for inviting me. I'm Miao Shangdai. I'm a graduate from SIA Penn State in 2019. I am now back in China. I'm now pursuing my PhD degree in national economics in China Academic of Social Science. And also I'm now working part-time for a local enterprise in Chengdu. And for me and my personal experience for the COVID-19 now in China is starts quite early. Actually, I started the personal quarantine back in January 22nd, as I told Professor Becker back then, right? And because that's even before the lockdown policy was brought out in Wuhan. And back then it was like there was only several thousand cases confirmed in China, and people are seeing this coming, but not taking it really seriously. But yeah, back then I took my temperature, and I found myself got a little bit fever, and then I started a quarantine. So in the next 2 weeks, I was all alone in my home, and it turned out to be a normal pneumonia. So luckily, I was not infected, and I was picked up quite quickly. So throughout like those several months, I was always constantly talking to my friends, both in China and abroad, for the effectiveness of policy that we are taking back in China now. And actually, the current situation in China is quite getting back to normal now. Actually, I am now traveling in Tibet now. I live in Chengdu. It's quite a weekend traveling trip for me, and we are because the government now is trying to pick up the economy, and they are sending out bonuses, even cash, to encourage consumers to get out and buy products and to travel. And I obviously I was one of them. So I want to share some ideas about the policies that China is taking, and why why we are able to control the virus so quickly as we are seeing. Because 2 months ago, China is almost the only place that is worrying about the virus, but now China seems to be the only place that's not worrying about this virus that hard. So let's start from the lockdown policy. Personally, I think the effectiveness of Chinese lockdown policy is largely based on the party organs, the Chinese Communist Party. I know might sound scary for some Westerners, but if you really study Chinese system, and you will find that the effectiveness of the party organs has showed its power. It shows its ability to solve problems, at least in this COVID-19 situation. Actually, I have a lot of friends working for the party, and we are members of the party too, and they went crazy. Their workloads these days was crazy, and I thought like they are really the heroes. Actually, grassroots public servants and members of parties will stand out to the street for like several months, from maybe January or February, and they need to take temperatures of every passersby, and they need to stand at the entrances and corners of each block and check temperatures and to take records of who's going around the streets, so that we can make our lockdown policy effective. But now we are seeing the same policy carried out in Europe and US. I'm not sure whether that's effective. As to the media coverage that I saw it might not be that effective, because people are still getting out for for even running, jogging, or something else. But back in China, because we are sending out people really seriously taking records of who is getting around, and that's also listed as a crime if you do not obey the quarantine policy. You might be sent to you might be sent to jail if you lie to the police that you've traveled to somewhere somewhere like viruses are spreading. And there are definitely motivations for, of course, for our for members of the party and the public servants to serve at these very special moments. Who for people who is actively participating and perform well in this campaign, and they'll get promotions after this virus, of course. And for people who escaped their duties, and they will be like marked as the underperformed members or officials, and that definitely will be politically a shame for them. And also for the resource pooling policy back in China now, as you guys might know, that China has showed its effectiveness of building hospitals. We've built like 2 hospitals that holds like thousands of beds in like 20 days or 10 days, and that's actually thanks to the ability to collect all the resources nationally. As you know, like China is a big nation. We got like more than 2,000 of provinces, and we thanks to the centralization of power, and we've been able to get the resources from the military and the state-owned enterprises, and even the privately owned businesses to set up the hospital. Actually, some of you might not know that most of the equipments in the for those 2 hospitals are actually donated by businesses, say air conditioners and laborers, workers, and they're like most of them are actually volunteer to do this job. And actually we got another quite interesting mechanism is a mutual help mechanism. And in this case, actually, there are 12 cities in Hubei province, which is the where the Wuhan city is in. Actually, during this fight against virus, we've set like 12 provinces to help. Each of the province will help a city, again, respectively. And if, for example, if province A is said to help city A in Hubei province, and or then the government of the province A need to take the responsibility of helping the city. They will need to send their medical professionals, send their public policies or even public servants to the city that they are supposed to help. And actually, this kind of mechanism is quite a frequent tool in the in Chinese government's policy toolbox. Recent examples would be the power lifting campaign. Actually, it's the same if one city or one county is officially registered as a county of poverty, as a poor city, there will be a mechanism that set it to be connected with a well-developed province or city like Shanghai. For example, Xinjiang is connected with Shanghai, and Shanghai government need to help the Xinjiang for their poverty lifting project. For example, universities in Shanghai need to buy the agricultural products of those of Xinjiang province to make the people back in Xinjiang make better income. And also there are like former examples in Western developments, and actually when we are trying to develop the western part of China, which is largely less developed, and back then we also had this kind of mechanism, like provinces in the east will need to pick and take a province in the east, and they set up partnership one by one, and they set up like mechanism to help people get better education and chance of education, get better jobs, and enterprises from the eastern parts of China will get better policies, even tax exemptions back to the western part. So this kind of partnership will help China to allocate or pool their resources and solve like problems that needs more resources. And also there is a little a great point about the military that I want to mention. As some of you might know, the hospitals and medical missions this time in Wuhan is largely taken by the army, the People's Liberation Army in China. And actually the two hospitals that I mentioned, the Hosen Hospital and Leisen Hospital, was overtaken by the POA, and also several other hospitals back in Wuhan is also overtaken by the POA. The POA medical professions are taking a large amount of medical burden, and yesterday they have the military, the army has officially finished their job, and they are trying to they are starting living Wuhan. That's quite interesting, because it's showing the effectiveness of the Chinese government or the party's ability to mobilize military and to cooperate with local governments. That's quite tricky back in US, because in the federal mechanism, and also this mechanism also shows its power in the PPE production. Medical supplies. Actually, it's quite interesting that we can also even buy masks that made by a firejet manufacturer. So that's quite interesting, and I think that's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Miashang. That was actually quite fascinating. I think we will pick up the conversation now with Sunyu Hua. And for those of you who are following, both the program and the more information about each of our speakers can be located in the conference website, and in the chat portion, I have put the link to those for those who are interested in those things. Professor Hua.
Hi, everyone. I'm workmate of Song Ping, and both of us come from the East China University of Political Science and Law, which is located in Shanghai. But now I live in Suzhou. We have more freedom in Suzhou, I think, because now many Chinese people go to Shanghai by plane because they think China is more safe. I think it is maybe 2 months ago, we can't imagine this thing. I want to say something changed after this, after the COVID-19 cases. I think first, in the past, Chinese government never do this to the people. We close a huge city. I think this is the first case in Chinese history. I still remember in 2003, when the SARS started in Guangdong province. We do not do this. We just control some families, but we do not control all the city, because the new virus, the COVID-19 virus is maybe is a dangerous virus in Chinese history, maybe also a dangerous virus in the world. Second, the economy, the Chinese economy and the world economy are damaged seriously these days. We do not know what will happen in the future, whether there is a huge economic crisis for this year, in these years. We also pay a lot of attention to American economy, because if American economy decline in the future, it will maybe a new financial crisis will happen, and maybe it's more serious than the 2008 crisis. Third, I think Chinese political situation now it is quite complicated, because these years the Chinese leaders centralize many power. They change the constitution, and many people say because the local official do not have the real decision, cannot do what they want by themselves. They cannot make decisions by themselves. They should observe serious obligations if they cannot control the virus. So they select a bad solution. And I think the fourth change is that Chinese international station, because these days I find the Japanese government and the American government, they say these countries should withdraw the investment in China, because China is do not have a clear situation for their business. Chinese government do not say something real, so they cannot believe Chinese business situation. This is a big problem for China. But I think now what Chinese government should do is to change the system, change the system to of Chinese. I think that Chinese government should give more freedom to Chinese people. Many people, many foreigners do not trust Chinese government because the Chinese government do not give enough freedom to their citizens. This is a big problem. If our media stay in the middle, maybe what the media say will can get us the trust from the outside world. And nowadays, I think Chinese people pay heavy cost in order to control the virus. But now, many foreigners say China should pay a lot of money for the virus. They say some lawyers start cases in the court. But I think every Chinese people should observe the compensation. It is not equal. Because even Chinese people do not know what happened when the virus start to go outside. Yes, they are damaged first, and now Chinese economy is not very good because, as you know, China need a lot of export to give enough opportunities for the workers. Now, maybe 20 million people lose jobs because the many other countries have bad situation. So although Chinese government say the economy will be better in the future, but I do not have the I cannot believe this. So I think the most important thing for us is we are staying in the same boat. We should cooperate each other. First, we should conquer the virus. Chinese government should develop the vaccine. And the American government should also encourage their companies to do the same thing. This is most important. And we should check the virus quickly and control the situation quickly. Until now, I do not know whether we have good medicine to deal with this disease. But I think if we have enough resources, we can control it. I hope every country's people, every people should know if we do something like anti-globalization, it is not a good solution to deal with the situation. Maybe if we do these things, a huge financial crisis in the history will happen. This is my opinion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. Again, a number of quite interesting and provocative thoughts for which we should be able to have some really good discussions. We've been looking and we're speaking about China from the inside with our first three speakers. Our last two speakers in this section will be looking at China in a sense from the outside in, and then the inside out. And in that context, let me start with Sean, and then we will end with Penn State's own Alice Hahn. So, Gao.
Oh, hi, everyone. This is Gao Shan. I'm Penn State graduate SJD student of Professor Larry Becker, and right now I am working in the Middle West as a legal editor at Thomson Reuters. So first of all, I would like to discuss this as a Wuhaner who is living outside from the very beginning. So I would like to first start with by saying that of Wuhan current situation, it is better now in Wuhan, but this is definitely far from normal. Since late March, since progressively but slowly changing, that means some companies, not all of them, are back to work, and entertainment establishments like cinemas or karaoke's has not opened yet. There are some shopping going on, and I heard from my friends there are people even go to the barber shop having their haircut, or go to the mall and buying for stuff for leisure shopping. But people are still worried about the virus. So this is definitely far from normal. What's the differences from before the virus? So basically people in Wuhan right now, everyone is wearing masks like the rest of the China, and people need to get to tested negative before they can enter their own buildings for work. If they go to visit a different buildings, they need to get their temperature test. And companies would distribute disinfect and mask to their employees. So there's no dining situation happening at all at the restaurants or in the cafeteria, or could be a limited seating situation. That means people sitting away from each others. So that's in Wuhan. And in the US right now, we are actually approaching to the peak of the virus outbreak for some places. I mean, some places, that means like in California, Washington, DC, or Philadelphia, or New York cities, for those places. And we are still uncertain that whether the other places going to reach to the peak or the terrible situation like New York City. And we are experiencing the high daily death rate, lack of spaces to handling those deceased, and overwhelming healthcare service systems. So everything happening in Wuhan, repeat here again. Back to my thought. So here are a few things on the top of my mind. First of all, I keep reminding myself that I'm the beneficiary of globalization, and I'm the beneficiary of the free flow of information, capital, and people, especially in this COVID-19 virus. Why I say that? Because I first read about the virus online, and thus be able to warn my parents early about the issue of the virus. Unlike many, many people, either in Wuhan or not in Wuhan, either in China or outside of China, they learn their information from a limited source and thus victimized from the infection due to the outbreak. They rush to stores, they rush to hospital, they rush to escape. They got infected. They die so fast and in such unnecessary and tragic ways. I'm saying this in a sense of anger and regret. So I have to say, no matter what's going on in the future, I keep reminding myself I'm the beneficiary of this free flow of information. The narrative was about the virus was at the beginning was containable and low contagious in January in Wuhan. It is understandable that it was actually crafted with cautious because no one expected the magnitude and the severity of the virus outbreak. But since it happened so fast and so drastic, so Wuhan was under lockdown, and that was historical. I still remember that I warned my parents to prepare the supplies early before the lockdown was issued in the 23rd of January, and discussed about canceling their vacation plan with my grandma, who lives in a different province. And it is understandable that for a long period of time, that for the virus outbreak, the authority of the governments around the world produce a limited and a cautious response at the beginning of the outbreak. However, we do understand now such response might not be the best response to COVID-19. And I think it is really a time to reflect and to truly thinking about what is the proper response to issues. I think it's a good timing for us to have a deep dive and a self-reflect, because that's the best way to honor and the best way to respect those who lost their lives in this pandemic. And the second thing I like to, another thing on my mind is that I think it is grand to be thankful to government and the leadership to invest a lot in fighting the virus. However, I think it is quite clear and obvious that transparency, independence, and honesty are the real luxuries that many do not able to afford right now. So I think it is an interesting aspect. On the economics, so this is interesting. Sun just mentioned that. I would like to say in January and from the late January to the beginning of the February, what I heard, I work in downtown here in a US city. So at that time, there's nothing going on in the US, or the media here is only focusing on the Democratic presidential nomination. So they didn't focus too much on what's going on with the virus. They reported, but they now report it as something going to happen here in the US. So what I heard a lot on the street is that, okay, our companies have this order, they have to be canceled, blah, 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 because the outbreak and the factory stopped working in China. And right now, as approaching to today, the US is completely most places on the lockdown. So what happened is when China or the Wuhan is slowly back to their work, there are a lot of orders had been canceled by their US customers. So I definitely echo to what Sun has mentioned, that on the economy side, this is going to not be good for a lot of people, and it is very, very unfortunately. And it is also interesting to mention that American truly does not really considering this virus as a lethal or threatening to themselves for a very, very long time. What I can say is that you can check the US stock market. They are performing very, very strong in February and even in early March. It is really until the second week of the March, the market finally realized that the government is not able to contain this. This is not going to be resolved in a faster pace, and we are going to enter a period of uncertainties. And it is really at that time that finally the mask is off and we are entering this nightmare-ish. And it is spectacular from my personal perspective, because I have been witness what happened in Wuhan, and it's quite a spectacular that how people are so confident that this is not going to happen in here. And I mean, in the middle of the March, I mean, many companies are still in this belief that they're not going to have something really terrible happening. I mean, the investment bank like Goldman Sachs, they're still having their conference going on, and it is canceled at the last minute. But that gives you a sense that no one really truly feeling that something terribly going to happening here, and that's is a caution that I reminded myself. So on the political level, I think what's on my mind is I don't think the virus is changed, but what I mean here is the sentiment. The sentiment after virus is different. So what people say, what people do, and how people react, it gives us more context. It gives us a more insight on why this person says things like this, why these people act that way. It gives us a sense of understanding and a guidance on why people do things like this way. And I want to say is, we did not start a fire, but the world has been on fire since forever. But no change, when I say no change, means people are creature of patterns and behavior. They rely on their pattern behavior and tendency of doing things they want to do easily, but they are not easily to be moved by because of this pandemic. So you are saying that this political attack is happening everywhere, whether it's domestically or internationally or geopolitics, but as I said before, the sentiment is different. So that gives us some kind of guidance on how and why people act this way. Last, I would want to talk about this emotional tolls on individual level, so the impact on individuals. I think from the plus side is that the most rewarding part of this pandemic, as my father reminded myself, is that you have to take this as a lesson to self-reflect and learn something. You know, this is a chance that the life gives you, so you can learn something from it. I think one of the lessons that I have is to be critical thinking, is to be more critical about the source of the information, and to be more critical of myself, how to handling and manage my emotion. You know, when people are facing or experience dramatic changes in their lives, people normally have two types of reaction, two mode, which is first is hot mode, the second is cold mode. The hot mode means people are acting drastically, extremely. They're trying to cope with sudden change in their life. And the cold mode is a more calm, and they trying to navigate through the difficulties with their reasons and logic. So I think right now, on individual level, even on the more societal level, I think we are experiencing this hot mood to cold mood. So I think we really need to be careful about what's going to happen next. And from the negative part of this individual impact for the pandemic, I would say is the excruciating process of this emotional toll, especially for me as a Wuhaner living in the US. This especially hit me at home personally. And especially seeing familiar street and city landscape on TV in the breaking news, not in a good way, but for a nightmare pandemic happening. From January to March, I worried about my family in Wuhan. And it is excruciatingly painful to see people dying in hospital, bodies laying ground, nobody handling, and the people died in the hospital alone by themselves. And the people died first, in the husband died, and the wife died, and the in-law dies. The only survivor is the child and the family, because the virus is so contagious and so fast. And from January to March, I worried about my family. I talked to them every day. I asked them how to prepare themselves. And right now, from March to ongoing to the future, my parents start worrying about me, especially they are hearing all the news in China talking about what's going on in the US. For better or for worse, those informations are partially true and partially exaggeration. So for whatever reason that is. So that definitely made my parents a little bit unsettling. And the truth is there are unsettling things going on. But America is such a huge country, and different places handling the situation quite differently. And I would say the virus, the pandemic itself presented the humankind as such a unique perspective and a lens that for us to see the true heroes come, show their colors, shine on, and the true villains also showing their true colors. So this is definitely one of the free chances for you to see those people's true color. And I think that's both the negative and the positive part of it. That's basically all I have to say, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Really fascinating. We're going to end our China speakers with Alice Hong, who is next up, a student here at the School of International Affairs. Alice.
All right, thank you, Dr. Becker. So, well, first of all, welcome to our webinar, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. So my name is Alice, and I'm a second-year master's student here at Penn State School of International Affairs. And I would say that this outbreak of the coronavirus has caught us all by surprise. And as my other fellow panelists just said about the measures that China is taking and how the world is looking at this coronavirus, I'm going to talk about it from a different approach. So even though there are challenges that we're facing right now, but we are able to put in efforts to combat those challenges. Well, my passion lies a lot on youth involvement in the global arena, and I think this pandemic is a good time for youth to reflect, learn, and take actions. So therefore, I want to focus my talk today on how youth and civil societies like nonprofit organizations are playing an important role in raising awareness as well as doing their part in the society to help people in need. So these measures include, but it doesn't necessarily limit to donations of money and health supplies. And one of the more recent examples would be UNICEF, as one of the leading international nonprofit organizations has been working on releasing videos to help people understanding quarantine and the safety precautions associated with it. And they also started an online campaign to raise money for children in areas who are in urgent need of care. And at the start of this outbreak in China, UNICEF was one of the first respondents amongst all the civil societies to help gather personal protective equipment to help China. So with the involvement of all those civil societies, I think nations around the world, and especially in a lot of developing nations, they're able to have access to resources to at least promise the need of its frontline care workers or people who are the most dangerous group during this virus. So I will also say that, well, the frontline care workers and the government are working tirelessly around the world to combat this pandemic, but this is also a time for people to appreciate the virtual world as forms of communication during their quarantine at home. And I would also say that China and its success in containing this pandemic, it's sort of like setting an example for the rest of the world, but also beyond their national borders. Chinese medical teams, after they've went over their peak time and after the virus was contained within China, they're able to go overseas and help other nations where they need assistance. Like there was a medical team that went to Italy recently to help them alleviate some of the pressure from there. And the Chinese embassy is also helping students overseas by providing them with self-protective equipment, or assisting them in getting those resources at their local place. And to conclude briefly about what I want to say today, I think this pandemic ultimately is teaching us a lesson. It's teaching us a lesson in how countries should prepare themselves for such a time and for the future. But it's also teaching us a moral lesson on how the world should work together during this time, and also for the future as well. So thank you. Back to Dr. Becker.
Well, thank you very much. These are just fascinating interventions. I wonder, before we opened it up, and we've got a few minutes left, I wonder before we open it up if the rest of our participants, Flora, Penny, Nicholas, Karen, might want to take a minute, a brief moment to make a comment about what you've heard, and then we should have time at least for a question or two posed to the folks who've just spoken. So, anyone? A comment or suggestion? No? Well, Alice, do you have, we have some questions that were posed. I can also use the chair's prerogative to ask a question, but as I understand it, there were some questions. Do you want to pose one to the group?
Yes. So one of the first questions that I'm seeing right now is from Hassan, who asked, if the US and China sue each other in the international courts, what could be the impact on the rest of the world and the Middle East?
Great question. Panelists?
I have a quick response. Okay, a quick response, a very short one, so everybody can join in. I think the international court would be thrilled to have these opportunities to have to have representatives like the US and the Chinese government would willing to use their venues to resolve such issues. So to my sentiment, to answer that question, my sentiment is I think it is unlikely they would use international court for this, but they definitely would go through all kinds of all possible channels to express their strategies, you know, to maximize their strategies benefit. So I give the back to everyone else.
Other panelists, responses? That's a really great question, and of course a very
Can I say something?
Yes, my goodness, of course.
Yeah, this is a very good question. Actually, we talked about several days ago with Yu Hua and also with Professor Becker, Gaoshan, Karen, and Flora. And I think it depends on who of the USA, who of the China. If it points to the government of the USA or the government of China, I think it's quite impossible, because I quote from Professor Becker, in the earth, the two countries who are not respect for the international law, the international law is China and USA. So I don't think that the government of the USA and China will sue each other on.
Oh. Oh. Soon you can't hear you. Oh, we have bad internet connection. Sorry. We'll get back to Sun Ping when he can rejoin us. Soon, of course, this is if you want to talk about the principal effects of COVID-19, you've got one right here in the challenges that technology provides us and some of the difficulties, but hopefully he'll come back. We've got another question, which I think is an interesting one, and really it applies as much to this panel as it will to the panel that's coming up. There have been some reports that China is underreporting the number of cases that it has had. With this in mind, how likely is it that the curve will stop flattening, and how likely is it that this will happen anywhere else? So the question involves two things. One is underreporting, two, underreporting in China, and three, consequences of underreporting in terms of the ability of actors, public and private actors, to meet the challenges posed by the reality of the illness. Panelists?
Can I answer that?
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun. So I'm really interested in these questions because actually they happen to have a lot of discussion about this when Wuhan was in the outbreak during the February, because to answer that questions, what I want to say is probably there is underreporting, but you are going to hear from some kind of more authoritative answer would be, official answer, this would be not underreporting, but a more complicated statistic or reporting system. So for underreporting, what the sense is that you have numbers that are being reported by the sources on the media that is different than what you experience in real life. And I agree there is a gap, and this sense and this experience, this feeling is real. The feeling is real, not saying this is completely just feelings, because you can see the from the medical resource is being used, or the measures is not coming up to what you expected. So there is some sense in it, but there are many complicated issues in it. There are problems of how to diagnose this person and sure this person is having being positive for this virus. That's for one thing. For scientific reasons, there could be a underreporting. And there is also, there are issues that being too cautious, they're trying to maintain some kind of social stability, trying to be more cautious about, so they are being more conservative on the numbers. And so that means there is a gap, a real gap between what we feel the number is and what has been reported. And for various reasons, good reasons or maybe bad reasons. And to flatten the curve, I think that could be a real issue because it will affect the modeling, statistical modeling. Okay, I give it back to the floor. That's my answer.
Well, thank you. Other panelists, I have a couple of very brief thoughts on both of the questions. They're actually quite fascinating. With respect to the last question, the problem with numbers is that the world has been taught over the last 200 or 300 years to believe that numbers are somehow more permanent and real, and they have a significance, something more than words or sentences. And yet you really can't understand numbers unless you understand their context. And part of the problem about numbers and part of the problem about underreporting and the consequences is in fact a twofold problem. One is an internal problem. How is it that you are going to count? And how is it that what you're going to do affects the count, and how transparent are you about that? And that's a problem for every entity that counts. The second problem, and the key problem for all of us here on the global stage, is assuming you can solve all those problems, the way China counts and the way the US counts and the way Germany counts are going to be very different. And even worse, the way China counts in December may not be the way China counts in March. The way Italy counts in February may not be the way Italy counts in April. And so you've got these problems of both scalability, transposability, and comparability. And yet, for most of the global discourse that we've been having over the course of the last 3 or 4 months, we assume all of those things away, assume that all of the numbers are quote unquote correct, that all of them are internally robust, that all of them are developed in a consistent and applicable way, and that they're all the same. And so part of our problem, and then ultimately, because that's not true, it becomes politically useful to start playing with these differences to suggest that there's something other than they are. So my only point with respect to the numbers is you have to be extraordinarily careful. They suggest a sense of where things are going, but in terms of actually using them for very, very robust comparisons or to make interpretations, I don't think we're anywhere near that. With respect to the issue of the lawsuits, there are two ways of looking at this. One, and they're both very important, and I don't mean to denigrate either one. But the one that everyone is fascinated with, we tend to live in a world that has been fed on notions of reality TV. And we love drama and theater. And to some extent, the notions about suing, either the internal discussions about it, which is less robust, but it's still somewhat there in China, the notions about suing them either by people who are in positions of authority or common folk or the social media, is that it effectively feeds theater. And to look at it, one has to understand it for what it is, which is politics, but politics in ways that people have begun to understand the discourse of politics now at the international level, which is all through law. And so we've lost our ability to actually talk politics to each other anymore. It becomes offensive, people get angry. And so the only way you can actually talk politics at the international level is to deploy the language and the modalities of law. So how do I talk politics if I'm angry with China because I believe that they could have been more upfront with me? Aha, I will suggest that there's some responsibility embedded in an international document, that international document then creates a kind of contractual obligation, and that losses springing from what I believe to prove as a breach of their contract will then produce damages, which can then be assessed against them to be paid to, I don't know, an international body or someone else. The language is legal, but that's what we've gotten used to. But the objective is politics. And it's really quite telling in a way. The lawsuits are actually an important component of COVID-19 to expose, in fact, both the ways in which the language of discourse at the international level has become embedded in these legalisms. And then the second problem, of course, with that is the limitations and constraints of what we've now gotten into. If in fact the world is now reduced to legalizations, what we see is frustration because the law and the language of law may be inadequate to the sort of conversations, political conversations, that we ought to be having within the community of states. And so, and beyond that, is, you know, with respect to any kind of merits, the question becomes irrelevant. Because in order to get there, you have to accept in the first instance that in fact, this legalization is both true, is both binding, and is somehow rationalized in a way that everyone understands. So I won't say anything more about that, but there it is. And sorry for the intervention, but two really good questions. Last little point that was raised by one of our participants, even if you wanted to go into this international legal thing and file a lawsuit, the fundamental question remains, which has always been the fundamental question in these kinds of things, and that is jurisdiction. Who's suing? Who can make the claim? Who's got the rights? Against whom are you suing? The state, the operators of the state, or the people? And this goes back, of course, there's an international discourse and a legal framework about this that goes back 100 years or so. But the problem remains, in this case, even more interesting and more difficult.
I have
think.
something to add
Yes,
to
please.
what you said. I basically, to just introduce myself first, I'm Nicholas Scholz, German national. I am a graduate of Ludwig Maximilian University in Political Science in Munich, Germany. Have been working in the past for several government institutions, the last time for NATO in Brussels. Right now, I'm currently considering myself an independent researcher, and at the same time work for a French company doing international services for students. However, to just follow up on some of these thoughts, I think what you said, Larry, is very interesting. I think, you know, your blog is called Law at the End of the Day, and maybe COVID-19 is certainly, or could be described as law at the end of the day, right? I mean, the point is that we already have seen in the last couple of years that law in the international arena has not proven to be very resilient. As a European, I know that, for example, in the financial crisis and in the European debt crisis, there was a lot of political hiccup going on over the question whether, for example, the European Central Bank would have a mandate to actually fiscally intervene within the crisis. And that was also framed as a question of law, but however, it was not sufficiently solved, and it created a lot of political backlash and frustration. And at the same time, to give an example, more maybe in the Asian context, I remember the European Court, I think, of Human Rights decision in regards to the Philippines and in its quest with China about borders and ocean rights, fishing rights. So in that way, I think that really law has stopped being the mechanism to solve international conflict. And that's a big problem, because the question now is what comes next? If it's not law, what else is there to actually coordinate state actions or enhance cooperation? And in my opinion, it's far too early to tell what will happen. I think we are in some period of interregnum. Indeed, we don't know what will come out of there again. But on the other hand, data might be the key to that challenge, which we will witness. And it also, in that regard, would certainly tackle the issues of the fluidity and the flexibility we need to address these crises, because borders are not only re-emerging, borders are recreated. Some of these borders, they are basically shut down. I mean, give you an example. I mean, in Germany, we closed all the borders except for the borders to Brussels, to Belgium and the Netherlands. And well, the question would be why, but of course, it's all about the very, very dense trade relationship and economic relationship. But to some people or to some observers, it would probably not be really understandable why we are closing down borders to Czechoslovakia and other states on the east, but you know, not to the Netherlands and to Belgium. So yeah, that is my take on that. I think law at the end of the day, and Brave New Age with lots of data awaits us.
All right. Well, excellent. Thank you so much. We're about to wrap up this portion so that we can actually, and Nicholas provided us a nice segue from China through these international mechanisms to the rest of the world, to Europe and the like. But before we do that, I want to give the current speakers, besides my great thanks for all of your work and interventions, which were all profound and profoundly interesting, and hopefully provoked a lot of ideas and thinking, a last shot, a minute, please, a minute each. In the context, there were two other questions that I wish we could have gotten to, and perhaps we can talk about this later or after the conference or in the interventions. One of them was, so at the end of the day, who wins? It does, at the end of this, does China come out stronger than the West? Does the West come out stronger than China? And related to that, is at the end of this, do we see a convergence between the way in which the Chinese and the Americans approach things, despite the fact that their rhetorics are different, or do we see a divergence in the way in which they both talk about this and do it? And then, of course, there was a question, in all of these things, I'm going to generalize the question, who wins? Does this make the leadership of President Xi stronger or weaker? Does this make the presidency of Mr. Trump stronger or weaker? Those are the questions that have been asked. We probably don't have time to do them justice, but as you all wrap up for this section, each of you, a minute if you want to take them, and no more than a minute, please. Just final parting thoughts.
I think one of the final thoughts I would like to bring up is that during this time, during this pandemic, every country that is going through this pandemic at the moment right now, they are suffering. They're trying to contain this as much as they can, and so does everywhere else in the world. So at this point, I think that instead of putting blames on nations that might be taking weaker measures, that everyone should be focusing on what efforts they're putting in and what have they done to try and help containing the virus.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Well, thank you, panelists all. That was magnificent. We now move. We're going to get on the airplane that we can no longer get on and fly from China, which we can no longer really do without great inconvenience, to Europe and the United States, which we also can't do very well without accepting the possibility of a 14-day or more quarantine. And I want to now shift our direction from China to the rest of the world. We have a panelist with us who unfortunately could not be here, Maria Chiara Muraio, who's kindly provided us a short intervention. She is originally Italian. She has been working and living in Spain over the course of the worst portions of the pandemic. As you recall, Spain, like Italy, was among the hardest hit areas. And I am delighted. She is a professor at the university in the province of Valencia in Spain. She does a tremendous amount of work in private international law, and then with her colleagues also now looks at the convergence of public and private law. And it's from that context that she has graciously given her time to speak with us. And if all of this works well, Alice will be able to put her up so that we can hear her. And here we go again, the magic of modern technology. And I'll just babble a little bit while she is pressing the right buttons, and hopefully it will work. If it doesn't work, we have a number of people on the sideline. How's it going, Alice? There we go. Except no sound. Alice, don't mute your mic.
There we go.
All right,
Sorry about that.
All right.
Thanks, Professor Becker, for this opportunity to stay with you and to share my perspective, my personal experience during this complicated period here in Spain. I'm Italian, I live in Spain, I work in Spain, I work in a public university located in Castellón de la Plana. It's a small town near Valencia, and this crisis affected my life completely, affected my life as professor, affected my life as citizen. During the second week of March, the government introduced it because of the state of alarm, according with the constitutional rules, of course, introduced specific limitations, specific restrictions, limitation of movement, a restriction of activities, for example, commercial activities, restaurants, other activities connected with ceremonies, for example. So this crisis affected a citizen because of this limitation, because of these restrictions, but at the same time affected my daily life as professor also. Tomorrow we are starting the second month of this lockdown. So during the first month, I dedicated a lot of hours in order to reorganize all my activity, in particular my teaching activity, to adapt those activities to this new situation. This new situation for us is new situation for students also. So I adapted all my methodologies of the courses and the evaluation process. The state of alarm was extended twice, and we don't know, we are in the first step of this crisis, we don't know when we can start the second step with the gradual return to the social life, gradual return to the normality, maybe. So during the first week, I tried to reorganize all my activities, research activities, teaching activities, other external activities, for example, seminar, conferences. A lot of conferences, of course, were suspended, but in some cases we decided to continue those activities in a virtual way, using Zoom, Google Meet, and other instruments. Respected to the teaching activities, I dedicated a lot of hours, for example, to adapt the methodologies of my courses to those instruments, virtual instruments. My university has a digital plan, but we had a very short time to adapt our courses, to adapt our methodology to this situation, very short time. So I decided, for example, to reduce specific topic in my subject. I'm professor of private international law, and in my subject there are a lot of implications of this crisis. So I decided to reduce specific topic in order to introduce, for example, those implications, to show to the students, to show the real consequences. And in the end of my course, I would like to organize specific seminar with other colleagues to show the implication in contract law, for example, competition law. So it is very complicated moment, but sometimes we have a good opportunity to show to the students, for example, the possibility to show the real implication of this crisis in the private international law, international, transnational disputes. So it is interesting. From this point of view, the situation can give us a new opportunity. At the same time, in terms of evaluation process, I decided to change also the format of my exam. Big challenge, and I know it's a big change also for students, but I need to adapt also the exam to this new situation. Also the exam are virtual, so the format is totally different. For this reason, I now dedicate part of my time in order to develop specific activity, evaluation activity, to evaluate, continue activities to evaluate students, and a new format for the final exam. respect to the research activities, I can say that there are a lot of implications. Lots of countries are affected by the coronavirus. And of course, there are a lot of implications related to the human cost and economic cost of the crisis. At the same time, my first line of research, you know very well, Larry, is business and human rights. So in this specific topic, there are a lot of opportunities now to develop, for example, new research line connected with the situation, with these new situations. For example, in terms of supply chain management. In the last month, I spent 2 months in the United States with you, and we talk about due diligence process, for example. Now, I think we are in the very important moment, and we can evaluate the internal instruments of companies. Which type of companies? The leading companies, the leading company of the global supply chain. This instrument created in order to control, to avoid specific negative impact, to reduce this impact and to remedy. Now we can evaluate those instruments. We can evaluate in terms of human rights and in terms of labor rights. The effectiveness of those instruments, and sometimes we can work with business, for example, in the garment sector, one of the most globalized, and with enormous impact in terms of human, social impacts and economic impacts, and can be affected by this crisis, specific crisis. So we can work also side by side with those business who want to implement more instruments, more mechanism to introduce specific measures in order to avoid the negative impact of this crisis in their supply chain activities. And sometimes it is very important also, in the next months, we need to evaluate the responsibility of those business who committed abuses in terms of human rights, labor rights, during this period. So we are in this moment, we need to evaluate all those instruments, legal instrument, effectiveness of legal, international, regional, national instruments, but also the specific internal measures introduced by the companies, and evaluate also the effectiveness, but also the responsibility of those companies who have the specific power, specific influence in their supply chain. They have now the opportunity to implement and to remedy the abuses committed in the other company connected in the supply chain. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was, and I thank you virtually because she's not here, but a very interesting start to this. We move back to someone who's already introduced himself so he can go right into his discussion, and that is Nicholas Schultz. Let's hear some more about Germany.
I hear you, Larry. Thank you so much. So let me take the opportunity again to thank you all for inviting me to the panel and to this very interesting and lively discussion. In regards to the situation in Germany, COVID-19, I have already said, I think, the most important aspects of how we handled this crisis in the interview. So I would rather more talk about 3-4 points which are important to me and which I find very interesting to share with you, to wonder what you think about it and maybe generate also a discussion. So also from my personal encounters and experiences. The first thing, as I said already before in my short comment, is I think that we of course see a re-emergence and recreation or creation of borders, not only on the country level, but also on the state level, or the land level in Germany, how to call it, and the villages, and many measures to curtail freedom, but also, of course, to mitigate the impact, the horrendous impact of COVID-19. So I also know that because the French company I work for actually tries to help international students come to Germany to study, and of course, nobody actually can do that for now and for the foreseeable future. So I actually know how business are affected, who actually depend on these global freedoms we have taken for granted for a long time. That's very interesting because when you think about it, this kind of creation of borders or re-emergence of borders, it's not exactly only that it's borders which have been there, but like I said, borders are newly created, and that creates also a flexibility in how to handle people, how to handle networks, economic networks, social networks, and how to deal with geography. And that reminds me somehow a little bit about the creation of almost like no-go areas in fragile countries, right? I mean, usually we hear about these things from quite a distance. In Europe, everything fine, or in the US. But now we have also through the usage of data and the usage of technology, we have the possibility to see which regions or which places are mostly affected and where not to go. And that's just something I find very interesting. The second thing is, or the second point I would mention is also in relation to what Ping Sun said. I also think indeed that this crisis, COVID-19, is not so much changing the trajectory of the world. It's more about reinforcing this trajectory and reinforcing the tendencies we have already seen. On the very local level, I would say it like that. I mean, for example, there are a lot of people who are exhibiting solidarity, but there are also a lot of people by their actions who are worsening this crisis. I was in a supermarket 3-4 weeks ago, and I saw some people making pictures of empty shelves with no toilet paper. And I was actually curious, and I just went up to them and I said, what are you doing there, guys? And they said, well, they want to share this with their friends on social networks and and I was thinking about that. Well, there could be moments of comedy or moments of despair, depending on the perspective you take. But nevertheless, it sees that people have actually the capacity to worsen this crisis by their actions, to make it actually look more horrendous, or to reinforce the perception that certain goods are not available anymore to the population. And on the other hand, we have people clapping outside on the streets locally, and hereby also thanking the personnel and the doctors and medical staff in the hospitals. And here I want to make another point, and that is, I think we talked a little bit about how politics is shaped. We talked about the role of law. We talked about what comes next, and basically, in my opinion, looking at this crisis, it's really a systemic crisis. And of course, we had crises before where we could say, oh, it's systemic crisis, financial crisis, of course. But of course, this is another scale. It's a huge. It's actually a global crisis. There's never been something like this before, and you can, I mean, even in the language, you can already see this happening. I mean, when we had the financial crisis, we talked about banks and certain institutions too big to fail, right? And now looking at Germany, I don't know how it's in other countries, but we're talking about system relevant jobs. We talk about the bakeries or the hospitals, which are system relevant. And it shows that the relevance of certain actors within society is increasingly enhanced by the connectivity we are exposed to. And of course, not only banks anymore are too big to fail or too important to fail, but it's also the hospitals, maybe the electricity networks, and even the bakeries who are too important to fail. And here comes in the importance of narratives, in my opinion. And what I find really, really interesting is that the German government put out this, this national narrative of solidarity. We need to show solidarity. And I think that's nothing new. We saw that in the European debt crisis, people saying we need to show solidarity with the Southern European countries. But again, what in my opinion it shows is, of course, that solidarity depends on the perspective, right? What kind of solidarity do we want to achieve? For example, very simple. I mean, I know people in my personal network who work for Chinese companies who are engaged in the plastics industry. So these Chinese companies, when this crisis unfolded, they said, well, actually, we can make much more money with changing the production chains from plastics to masks and selling them to countries, for example, in Europe, right? And basically, well, they said, well, of course, it's profit is of course a driver, but at the same time, we say, oh, it's about solidarity. And of course, China ships these products here. And, but then again, a lot of people question that solidarity, right? They would say, well, that's not solidarity, but it's a way to undermine or to actually craft a certain image of China which is not in the interests of Western liberal democracy. But then again, you have civil society actors, like I said before, either on the village level, locally, people who are thanking hospital staff by clapping, or on the national level when the German government invites hackers in so-called hackathons to provide technological solutions. So in that way, I think solidarity has become a new kind of, how do you call this, a concept of combat. How to mitigate complexity, which cannot solely be achieved anymore by law, but which also needs autonomous actors who, when a crisis unfolds, when a crisis arises and you're not prepared for it, take action and help to somehow steer society in the right course. And yeah, that's a couple of takeaways and points I wanted to provide to this discussion, and I'm very eager to know more about what you guys think. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nicholas. Next up is Flora Sapio from Italy, who will be talking to us about things there. But just a thought, someone had reminded me, one of our audience, and thank you very much for the questions that are coming in. We may not be able to get to all of them now. It's not because we don't want to answer them. It's a combination of time and our ability to catch them quickly. But I will post all the questions and circulate them to our panelists. So keep sending them to us, and then we will post answers to all of these questions online. But in the context, and before Flora starts, because this is really heavily important in the European context, a question relating to reports that have been circulating that nations that are currently led by women, New Zealand is an example, have been reporting lower COVID infection rates and corresponding death. And the question revolves around the consequences for the ability of women to move faster and more and more noticeably into positions of leadership. So folks, keep that in mind as we work through the rest of our conversations. I just wanted to put that out there because gender, like a number of other points, tends to be forgotten in the course of talking about big ideas. So I wanted to put that out there first. Sorry, Flora, and that's yours now.
Hi, thank you. First, I wanted to thank you, all the panelists, for having me here. And I wanted to thank the audience, the public, for their attention. Talking about COVID-19 is never easy. I had thought of starting my very brief talk by, talking about numbers. But before you brought up the fundamental uselessness, in a sense, of, talking about figures, yet figures do shape our perception of the magnitude of the crisis and its extent. I will refrain from reciting the figures of the total number of cases in Italy, the people who died, the new cases, those who were hospitalized, and so on and so forth. It will suffice to say that we have been hit from the crisis really, really, really hard. And it's difficult for me to frame the topic as such because of its sheer magnitude. As a European, one of the biggest points of reference you have when you think about crises are the two world wars. And of course, the pandemics of the past. But in the face of the ongoing crisis, all those points of reference perhaps are no longer of use, because we are witnessing a situation that is fundamentally new and has changed our professional and our personal life in ways which were beyond any imagination just how long ago? We are on day 36 of the lockdown, just like 40 days ago. The lives we are living today would have been difficult to imagine. I might then start by briefly describing the measures that our government has adopted in an attempt to contain the spread of this virus. As you perhaps know, 3 regions in Italy have been hit really, really, really hard by the pandemic. Those are the regions of Piedmont, Lombardy, and Veneto, which incidentally are also the most economically dynamic, the wealthiest provinces in the country. We don't really know the reason why 75% of the COVID-19 cases that were registered occurred in those regions. Various hypotheses have been made, yet those are only hypotheses. One of the first hypotheses to be made mentioned, of course, globalization, the intense economic exchanges taking place to even those 3 regions, and I would say the rest of the world, not just China, not just Europe, but the world in general. Other hypotheses have mentioned the very high concentration of particulate matter in the atmosphere, PM 2.5, that could have acted as a carrier to the virus. Yet others have hypothesized that the difficulty to contain the infection in those 3 regions might be attributed to mismanagement of the epidemic since its very beginning. Yet those are only hypotheses. They would need to be proven, and it is difficult to come to any conclusive answer even in a short period of time, let's say 5 to 10 years. If the answers will come, you know, in a presumably a long time. In the meantime, what is the response that Italy has adopted? A state of emergency has been declared until July the 31st, 2020. And since March the 10th or the 11th, sometimes, you know, the distinction to even dates in this very special situation tends to fade in your mind. To even March 10th and March 11th, the country was placed on lockdown. Initially until April the 3rd. Then the lockdown has been prolonged until May the 3rd at least, when presumably phase 2 of the management of the epidemic might start. But what is going on in the meantime? What is it that we can do and what is it that we cannot do? We are, of course, allowed to go out, but only for essential needs, such as grocery shopping, buying medicine, visiting a doctor, also reporting a crime to the police might be another possible reason why you are allowed to go out. But whenever you leave your home, you have to carry with you a document stating the reason why you are going out and also your ID. Transportation to even provinces has been suspended. Movement outside of one's city of residence has been suspended. For instance, I do live in the city of Rome, but I do work in Naples. Even if the university were still open, I couldn't go to work because of this reason. What else? Shops. Most shops are closed with the only exception of pharmacies, supermarkets, newsstands, shops selling tobacco, and just recently stores selling clothing for babies and for infants. Those who violate these measures can be punished through administrative or criminal sanctions. If we talk about administrative sanction, then we're talking about fines. Those who are checked by the police, those who are stopped and checked by the police while outside of their home, might be subjected to a 400 euros fine if it is found out that you know, their movement took place without any justified reason. They can be fined up to 3,000 euros if they are found driving a vehicle, such as your car, for instance. And these limitations have had, as you can imagine, a severe impact on the economy, even though that impact has been felt in quite different ways by different strata of the population. Those who are in positions of relative privilege, such as myself, because they're working for the state, have been relatively unaffected. We are under a lockdown, we can go out, yet we can fulfill our, you know, economic needs. But yet a significant portion of the workforce in our economy is either employed in the informal sector, that means no job contract, or they are employed to so-called through what we call atypical contracts, which means temporary contracts that might last for anything, even 30 days and 6 months. And those persons have been hit in extraordinary hard ways by the ongoing economic crisis. And the same is true also for those who were and still are self-employed, managers of shops, of bars, of restaurants, of bed and breakfast, of hotels. The tourist sector has become, it doesn't seem an exaggeration to say that the tourist sector has become suddenly non-existent. And the same goes for most economic activities, even though roughly 40–50% of factories in the north of the country have gone ahead with the production. Another aspect that is worth mentioning, particularly in light of the speech of my countrymate, concerns always labor and supply chains, of course. A large proportion of the persons who work in the agricultural sector of Italy come from other countries. Some of them are documented migrants working on temporary contract in the northern regions of the country, picking fruit and vegetables. The real problem, though, might not be limited to the north of the country, but affect the center and the south. That is where you find the highest proportion of migrants who are not documented and employed in the agricultural sector, working under conditions that are objectively difficult to conceive. The problem here is threefold in a sense. It is a problem that concerns the strength, the resilience of the food supply chain of Italy, and indirectly of the countries that import part of their food from Italy. It's a problem that concerns epidemiology as such. If these persons are not documented, they do not exist for the state. They cannot be checked. You do not know whether they have been infected by the virus or not. You do not know whether they are contributing to spreading the virus or not. The third problem, the third aspect, concerns potential social tensions, in that those specific groups, particularly the persons who arrived to Italy without documents from sub-Saharan Africa, are sometimes, increasingly often, pointed at as one of the origins of the virus. So it's a complicated situation. It's a complicated situation that is geographically limited, yet connected to global flows of goods, of people, and of capital, perhaps, if you want to bring in multinational corporations. It's limited in some sense, it's global in other senses, but it might provide perhaps a good example or a good paradigm of some of the effects of the virus. And here I want to second Sun Ping, Zhang Gao, Nicolas Scholz. I want to second their observation about points of convergence and points of divergence. In a sense, this crisis is bringing out the best and the worst in absolutely everything and everyone. Governments, subnational organizations, private corporations, public corporations, individuals, group of individuals, everyone. And some of the tensions that are being highlighted are systemic. Nicholas spoke about a systemic crisis. This is only my personal opinion. This is, to me, more than a systemic crisis. It could be viewed as a crisis of an entire mode of life, of an entire way of life that needs somehow to be reconsidered or rethought, at least at the individual level. At least at the individual level, at least, because at this point in time, at least for me, it is very difficult to try to reason at the national level or even at the global level. Why? It in part depends on my expertise that is limited to domestic matters. I'm a political scientist slash historian who's been working on China. But in part, it might be due to the fact that, as Larry said, as Larry implied, the vocabulary that we have to talk about what goes on in the world, to think about what goes on in the world is in a sense limited. We have a vocabulary that it is composed, it is made by the language of law. And as you have observed, it's a language that does not allow us to communicate in a way that is suitable to the actual context, to the context of COVID-19. There is another vocabulary that we have, that we can use to talk about what is going on, and that is the vocabulary of numbers. But even that language is perhaps displaying its first signs of failure, or its unsuitability to convey certain ideas, certain meanings, certain perspectives on simply on what is going on. Crafting a new vocabulary, it is difficult, and it is not one of my ambitions. But at the same time, I have to admit that the limitations in the vocabularies that I can use, that I can attempt to use to think about the crisis and to try to imagine its future effects on domestic governance, on transnational governance, on politics, on economies, it's very difficult. It's objectively very, very difficult, at least for me as an individual. And this is essentially what I wanted to say. I could talk about, the reemergence of borders, and that is a very concrete phenomenon that we are witnessing in Germany.
Could you sum up?
Sum up. Difficult to. It's even difficult to try and bring together the threads of the ideas that I try to express. Two keywords perhaps could be used to sum up or to summarize or to try to get an idea of how to navigate through this period: flexibility and adaptability, at least at the individual level, and beyond this level, perhaps also on the level of groups of persons, regions, states, and groups of states. That is, I guess, all the contribution I can bring. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It is only the beginning of a profound conversation, but a lot of great thoughts and ideas and provocations that hopefully we can pick up at least a little bit. We move on now to Karen Wang, who is also an inside-outside person who will be talking to us, and I believe more on a comparative basis and more on a discursive concept. Take it away, Karen.
All right, thank you, Professor Backer. Oh yeah, that's just quick introduction. I'm Karan Wong. I'm currently assistant teaching professor at Penn State College of Liberal Arts, teaching communication arts and sciences. So I research critical legal studies and rhetorical theory. So in my brief talk, I sort of will focus on the areas of point that's I think are important in this discussion, but underexposed in the deluge of kind of constant streams of information that we're getting from all type of sources, right? So that's the part we'll focusing on, right? So first of all, it's on this in terms of comparative responses between, let's just say Europe, North America, and China. This very framing of the comparison, right? On the media, we love to look at China, look at US, look at Italy, for example. It's this kind of taxonomy does not really match the, if you say look at the material, if you look at the categorization of type of responses based on kind of a material outcome, right? It's a little bit odd. This is what I mean, right? So even I remember from the very beginning of this pandemic became headline news sometime around late January, early February. You start hearing this. A lot of reports in the US about this outbreak. It's less to do at that time about genuine concerns that this outbreak would be physically present here or a danger here in the US. At that time, there's an implicit, overwhelming, both you can hear from the media and from just, people talking that, there's this kind of, almost like a cognitive bias, what we call first world cognitive bias, in thinking that like broad calamities that apply to entire society somehow could not, right, happen in a developed country, right? That's a very prevalent bias, and it's counterfactual and yet normative, so to speak. So during that time, much of the reports that you hear and news in the US is focused on more of a kind of a bizarre fascination about this, the fact that a huge city in China with population close to New York and no one heard of went into full lockdown. And all the reports are actually focused not on the virus, but on various lockdowns, as if it's an altitude, exhibit of like a, futuristic dystopic movie scene to many American viewers. And then there's a mantra that's repeated in every news report, and then every analyst and even politicians at that time is like, wow, a lockdown like this would never happen in US, meaning restricted people in their homes, right? and sort of close that line. And if you're reading and watching, European news outlet too, that's largely mirrored to that talking point. What they're implementing in China could not be possibly done in Europe, right? And we, not even 4 or 5 weeks later, I mean, if you look at, Italy became the first hard hit, and right, and very similar, materially speaking, similar type of restrictions was imposed, the first in certain parts of northern Italy that quickly expanded, right? And it's so that's kind of narrative that is much more just on the narrative surface and less materially supported. It's that somehow this kind of, and by now we all kind of, right, obviously know that, but yet counterfactual and yet normative is that, right, a lot of the response is just physically, that's the only way to respond when pandemic become this level, and you want to avoid further taxing the, let's just say, existing medical system. But another bizarre, counterfactual, yet normative kind of obsession, I would say, in a narrative is the typology, that's fake categories of responses that's created. It's meaning like, oh, China has its own response, and you see a lot of spin in all different ways regarding the quote unquote Chinese type of a response, which I argue is not a type of response at all, right? It's neither unique nor distinctive. And then they are trying to say, oh, the people in the those democratic countries, they respond very differently. But no, I mean, if you look at the, say, both the what on the ground and people and the institutions are doing, and the outcome, meaning that, right, the relative impact of the disease is that, yeah, there is a sort of a type, there are two types of response. Those response that came from Asian countries that have severely impacted previously by the SARS and epidemic, and response in North America and Europe, where did not have much impact by the previous SARS pandemic. And I think first, it's that, right, we seem to, collectively, it seems like there's a huge myopic short-sightedness going on when it comes to collective memory on, whereas because this current ongoing event, the COVID-19, is so displacing in all life affairs that we kind of forgot the huge both material impact SARS had, right, despite its actual, right, like epidemic outcome is much more limited, but materially speaking, in terms of the resources that spent, right, back in 2002 and 2003, and then the institution shakeups that it led, and then economic costs, right, that it occurred, and as well as the collective memory that the SARS experience forged in a lot of, right, in China, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in South Korea, those countries that we seen back in 2002 and 2003, right, had a very similar type of response, though not nearly in scale, right? But that part, it became this kind of, let's just say, society in general, and as in total mobilization for disease, it's a pre-existing and relatively fresh, up till this point, collective memory and institutional memory in these East Asian countries, and Singapore and Taiwan and Hong Kong, and so on and so forth. Not a thing in Europe, and not a thing in North America outside of Canada at all, right? So that's number one. And then that's the delineation, really, in terms of responses, if you look at materiality, that have split. The same thing with face mask, right? Those countries that previously dealt with face masks, and during the SARS pandemic, and I look back into the news record, right? It's not that somehow South Korea and China just more culturally attuned to magically wear face masks when first signs of pandemic started to sprout up, right? The time between, let's just say, the pandemic started and then face masks become, let's just say, widely practiced, was quite much longer in East Asia during the SARS pandemic. But this time around, because of public memory so fresh, the moment the new virus news came out, the population in general instantaneously tapped into that collective memory in those countries of the SARS pandemic. And then instantaneously, you see Hong Kong, for example, almost overnight, everyone donning face mask. Whereas in US and Europe, the struggle with face mask, right, that's a tiny sliver of the larger microcosm of the different response because of the different collective memory. So I would argue, in terms of material reality, perhaps there's the overemphasis. And I think this overemphasis is both unintentional, but also there's a mixture of kind of political invested interest at hand to over politicizing a lot of element that is explained really by really right non-political factors here. And then if we really try to compare the different type of disease response materially, right, informed by material outcome and not by talking heads on the news and cranking out outrage about not outrage enough news articles, we'll find that really the division lies between those places, those countries, and had both the resources that stacked up right after the SARS pandemic and the collective memory on dealing with the SARS pandemic versus those places that did not. So that's what I will say in my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. You've given us a tremendous amount of food for thought. So we need at least another 6 hours to actually tease these out, but that would kill us all. But we now move, we've been looking at Europe, we've been looking at the US to some extent, and it is now time to shift gears to an area that certainly in the West tends to get very little attention. And we move ourselves to both Eastern Europe and especially the old, to Russia and the old parts of the Soviet Union and to Israel. There's a reason for that connection besides the knowledge that our next speaker brings, Penny Maretsky. The other reason is to some large extent, the actual connection, the dialogue within those areas is far stronger than people or the current social media classes give us a sufficient amount of attention to. And so it makes sense actually to talk about this in a regional context than it is to view these as substantially different. And with that just very brief introduction, I will turn it over to Penny Maretsky.
Hi, do you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So first, like the technological issues, so I have to apologize in advance if I'm breaking up. There are a lot of people in Israel who are on the web, and everybody are working from home. So I think that's one of the challenges, and our networks don't really hold up very well. So the first thing that I have to say is again, thank you. Two words of introduction just to give you a context, regions, and what else. International Humanitarian Organization. Okay. Sorry, an international humanitarian, which is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and I work at a section that deals with the countries of the former Soviet Union. So that actually gives me the privilege of being both in Israel, understanding the situation in Israel, and in those countries. On that note, I have to say that the views that I'm going to say are my only and do not represent the views of the organization where I work at any way. So please refer to it as that. In my history, in my academic history, I have a PhD in international law, transnational law, and I'm interested in the field of international legal theory. And I think, as many theorists say, we try to keep it simple, or to the way it's possible, and then we have to explain why this simplicity doesn't work. So let's start with the simplicity, and let's start with the three words, which I'll try to squeeze into my explanation. So the three key concepts, I think, to explain why I think that we don't increase. So let's start to talk about knowledge. So what is knowledge? And this was a couple of people raised that earlier today. But what is knowledge? What do we know about the disease? The knowledge that we know are things that are different. This is a developing situation. So different people have different views. With a lot of research going on about the disease, and our of research or peer review are problematic in that regard, because we have new knowledge coming in every day. We have different aspects, we have different countries. That knowledge is not exactly objective. Some people raised today, the level of tests that are done in each country differ significantly. And even if we take two countries with similar levels of tests, those tests do not represent, those tests do not necessarily represent the same test being done. So what are we comparing? When we're taking two countries with, let's say, relatively the same population, relatively the same level of tests, if we see that the number of people ill or dying in each country is it the same? I don't know. Now, this is being used, and this is the way that we'll try to connect that with these aspects of knowledge also to the aspects of who has the power or who has the legitimacy. So just to give you the context of this, as I said, as I mentioned, I'm working with the region of the former Soviet Union, are a part of a single, even a single block. They have a rather diff which is developing. So we see that
Penny, you're really breaking up.
One country, let's say Russia, is saying that yes, we have a pandemic. This
Sorry, folks. We've been doing really well up until now with the technology, considering everywhere on Earth we are trying to connect to. Apologies. Actually, it shouldn't be me who's apologizing. It should be the state of our technology. But then the technology gods will get mad at me, and bad things will happen. So I apologize. Hopefully, Penny will be able to come back on. We've lost him for the moment. In the meantime, I was going to speak, but I think rather than you've heard more than enough from me, I think. Rather than, Penny's back. Penny. Hello, Penny? No, well, we got the image, but not the person. While we wait for Penny, I was thinking that this would be a good opportunity. We've talked about a lot of regions, but I wanted to perhaps share just very briefly, maybe 5 minutes or so. I've got two folks here who I think would add a little bit of context. One is Yuri Gonzalez Hernandez, who can speak to us about the COVID virus from the perspective of developing states. For the moment, every state we've talked about has been highly privileged. It may be useful to see what the pandemic looks like from the perspective of a country that is less developed. And then if we have time, Bethany may speak to us quite pointedly and directly on COVID and its effects on supply chain in the context, not just on the ability to preserve the integrity of supply chains, but also in the context of corporate responsibility for human rights and sustainability. But let's see, let's give Penny another chance. Penny, you there? No Penny. All right, Yuri?
Yeah.
Speak 5 minutes or so on Cuba.
Okay. Oh, hello everyone. My name is Yuri Gonzalez. I'm taking a master in law here in Penn State Law. Fortunately, I'm learning a lot for the Professor Becker. In my personal experience, is like for me, it's different because we in Cuba, as a no developed country, we have seen this situation just in the movies. We have seen movies in which the people have to communicate through the computer, and I have never imagined deal with this situation personally. So, well, as Cuban, we always have been deal with difficult situation. So, as you have seen before, this problem have to be solved. But the problem mainly is how the different countries take this pandemic in this moment, because the solution there is not in our hands. Even if the people are optimists, we have to be realists that it depends more of the personal interest than the government will. So I have been taking my studies here since 8 months ago. So I have been in this deal with this situation here in the United States. So from 1 month, but monitoring the situation in my country and other countries in the Caribbean. Yes, we have been affected mainly because these countries depend of the tourists. So that, as the professor Flora Sepio said before, is like inexist in this moment. Mainly in this situation in Cuba start for the tourists. We receive tourists precisely from Lombardy. I'd say precisely because Lombardy is one of the most affected areas in Italy. So that is not the reason of the virus, of the spread of the virus in Cuba, but was the first patient that we had. That was just 36 days ago, and at that time it was just 3 cases, and now we have more than 800 cases. The Cuban people don't have this kind of technology for be up to date about the situation around the world, so they depend just of the news that the Cuban government provide. So the Cuban government has taken different measures for to get up to date the people, but as we know, it's always driven by this kind of narrative in which goes through the political situation. Because in my case, for example, my family goes to try to find a way to contact me because they are worried about the situation in the United States, but they even have aware about the situation around them. There is sad because it's the same in different countries like Panama or Peru, that in which the spread have been faster in the same time, in the same period. The thing is that at least in Cuba, I can say that there is like a good medical system, healthcare system, but not in the rest of these countries, that there is no developing countries. The people, there is not aware about the healthcare. So these countries maybe have technology or more tools for get the information of the news, but they need to know more about how to control the spread, because as we know, it's the only way to stop this. Unfortunately, nobody have the data in which this curve it will be going down. So the economical situation in these countries is going to be worse. So it's like something to be worried about it, mainly because these countries, there is not developed countries, they don't have a structure to take care about a lot of people who are suffering this kind of sickness. So there is some kind of measure that I have seen in the news. For example, in Peru, they have like a tunnel for disinfecting because they believe that if the people go through this tunnel, they can go to different areas and buildings, even workplaces, because they are disinfected. But the thing is that Peru right now is going through 14,000 of infected people. So unfortunately, they don't have the healthcare system, but also the knowledge of how to deal with this situation. It's something sad in the world, but I think that every government have to work together for take care about the people, and the people need to be more informed and up to date about how to deal with this, because it's depend more about the people than what the government can do for stop this situation. So that is my perspective. I hope in some point help, or at least you have some background about what is going on in these places. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yuri. Bethany, you got 5 minutes. Talk to us about the most important thing on earth to some people, which is making money on through systems of global production so that we can go get our toilet paper and we'll have jobs and governments will have income through taxes. It's all yours.
So the consumer products industry right now is certainly an interesting place to be working. And as a bit of background, I'm currently finishing up my international affairs degree at Penn State, but I am actually physically working within the consumer products industry. So I've had kind of an interesting firsthand account at what is going on in the world of trying to supply in the time of coronavirus. And I think one of the key things that people have latched onto is this idea of panic hoarding and a huge rise in demand that it was really unexpected and has hit a lot of supply chains by surprise. And it's certainly made for a challenging time to be in an industry where you're trying to supply things like food, or in my case, I'm working with a company that provides things like personal protective equipment. And so trying to respond to this unexpected demand has definitely thrust people within these organizations into new roles and trying to respond in a global way to this global issue. And one of the things that I've seen some articles about out there is this idea of, with the closing of borders and the need to restrict travel and concerns about even packages arriving to an end consumer and potentially being infected with coronavirus because of its ability to stay on hard surfaces. The idea of being able to protect people within both the supply chain and the employees that work within these organizations, but also the need to protect those end users and the people who are receiving products is of the utmost importance right now in global supply chains. And what I would argue is that global supply chains are really what are going to get us through this. The idea of closing borders and needing to restrict the ability to export or import products really is the idea of protectionism, and wanting to stay within your borders is difficult when you rely on these global supply chains to be able to provide products like personal protective equipment or imported food products. And so globalized supply chains, being able to minimize companies' risks by having those global resources, is what's going to keep supply chains going right now. And that's what I would argue is really a benefit of globalization, and the ability that we have to lean on areas of the world right now that perhaps are able to fill supply gaps when other parts of the world are shut down due to coronavirus. So in terms of globalization, I think that it's going to help us to get through this pandemic and keep operations moving. But as I mentioned, organizations also have a responsibility, not just to those people who are receiving their end product and need to know that their products are safe and that they're going to be effective, but also to those within their supply chains who are helping to produce goods and helping to make sure that those operations keep going. And companies have responded in a number of different ways. Some have been called out for their responses and been criticized for how they're handling the situation. But as everyone's experiencing, we're all having to make adjustments and kind of take a collaborative approach to how we can best address issues in the workplace, such as being able to work remotely or providing as much personal protective equipment as possible, but also increasing sanitation measures and ensuring that being able to fulfill demand and at the end customer level, we have to be able to also protect those who are making that happen and make sure that we're being measured in our approach to actually producing and getting that out to the end consumer. So I think it's definitely an interesting time to be in the consumer products industry. And I think companies overall are looking for ways to protect their employees and trying to be responsible. But issues of human rights and sustainability are certainly in a pressing spot right now, and it's a difficult question to address.
Well, thank you very, very much. And we are, and for those of you who have managed to stick with us for the past 3 hours, I salute you. This has been one of the difficulties of these conferences on Zoom is that we don't have the personal interaction, but one of the best parts of personal interaction is that we can actually call for breaks and relax in ways that we haven't yet learned how to do through the mechanisms of Zoom. So I apologize for the marathon. We're on a learning curve like most everyone else. This is, in fact, the conference is itself a nice example of the consequences of pandemic in terms of the challenges it brings to people like us. We're in the business of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination, and there's a lot of work to be done, none of which will disappear when the virus, quote unquote, goes away or goes dormant or whatever it is it will do for a little bit of time. But anyway, thank you all for hanging in there. A question, as I gave an opportunity to the speakers in in the first session, any comments or reactions from those of you who spoke in this section? Flora, Nicholas, Karen, Yuri, Bethany, any comments or reactions or responses that you might want to make? Or Penny, hopefully, if you can get back. And while you're thinking about that, I note in this chat section, I noted that much of what, and Penny again apologizes for the bad state of connections, again, another challenge, but much of what he was going to discuss, we touched on in the interview we conducted with him a couple of days ago, and those can be found, his interview can be found on the conference YouTube channel. And so if you're interested in hearing some of the very, very interesting convergences and divergences between Eastern European and Israeli approaches, especially touching on technologies, surveillance, and the like, you're welcome to his interview. Any other comments? Oh,
so I'm just really real quick wondering, because right now we're in the deep of the pandemic, and mostly we're from North America, Europe, and settings. Where relatively speaking, both we have all the strategic reserves and relatively developed to various degree health care system. So I'm just wondering that in the foreseeable future, when this disease spreads into Mexico, say, or start to Bangladesh, for example, the rest of the world, then meaning that even if we are managed to flatten the curve, say, quote unquote, beat it, whenever the definition of this, say here in Europe or here in North America, that if much of the let's just say developing economies, and right, it looks like Brazil too is fully on the upswing. It's become the next kind of hotspot. Then wouldn't that be a matter of time that this thing will kind of circulate back to, the places that allegedly, right, have overcame the pandemic, right? So that's or are we? So if that's the case, then what is the prognosis on responding to that, right? Would the resources be pouring into these countries to help them to deal with it? Are there enough, right? Let's say if next couple of months Bangladesh becomes the next hotspot, would there be enough resources that's from, say, Europe and North America going into there, or we're seeing even more of kind of like a draconian border restrictions that effectively bifurcating the entire globe in the next few months?
I could maybe give it a try to give my perspective on what you just said. I think I think there are two options, and maybe one of these options is to be found in China, which is called, I think, the social what is it called, the social grid management system, right? In terms of preventive policing, right? If we talk about borders and if we talk about unforeseen risks, also geographically related, that indeed, as you said, borders become maybe more important, and you will need to find a system which enables you to quickly shut down specific areas in a short amount of time.
Uh-oh, Zoom is getting really tired. Apologize for that. While we give Nicholas a chance, are you back?
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
Actually, I have a question for Nicholas and Flora. So right now, I ask Flora first. In this pandemic, lots of governments start to point to each other like 5 years old kids. For example, inside the United States, the state government, criticize each other to other state government, and also criticize the federal government. And is there any similar situation happening in Europe? I mean,
can you say that again? I don't know if.
Oh,
sorry.
Welcome back.
I was gone. Sorry. Can you say that again?
Yeah, sure. My question is, inside the European Union, is there a situation that the European countries criticize each other, or fight each other, or criticize the European Commission or European Union? Is there anything similar happened like inside the United States, between the state government and the federal government? Thank you.
Okay, sure. I could tell you if you are interested. So basically, on the German, even in the German context, you will find these. You will find these confrontations between local government and or Landesebene in Germany, Landesebene, state level, and federal government in regards to how to handle the crisis, because. As we, I guess, all agreed, the implications of the crisis and the repercussions of the crisis are not everywhere the same. They have not everywhere the same kind of magnitude and the same types of consequences. One example I could give to you is that industries being affected, right? Flora talked about agriculture being affected. And some states are more reliant on agriculture than other states. And some states are more reliant on tourism than other states. And you can go on and on and on with that list. And of course, this creates a conflict, political conflict, and also the risk of fostering economic inequality between regions, villages, states, right? But also on the European level, it's interesting to note that that the crisis, again, as Sun Ping, as you stated before, exacerbates tendencies which have already been there. So, for example, Corona has heightened the chance that a country like Hungary actually pursues a more authoritarian track, right? The government has decided to give itself complete total measures. And on the other hand, you have countries, for example, like Italy, which is interesting to note because the Italian government has been in the past been very critical towards the EU, but now would probably favor a more stringent European response because they are mostly affected by it. And indeed, here again, problems arise because only, I think, 2 weeks ago, the German government decided in an act of European cooperation, decided to take some of infected Italian citizens in German hospitals. I think it was only around 10 infected Italians, which the German government flew, or the German military flew to a hospital in Düsseldorf, a German city in West Germany. And it created actually quite an outcry because some German citizens were saying, well, I mean, there's shortage of hospital beds, and we as Germans, we need to worry about this crisis by ourselves as well. Why would we help the Italians? I'm not saying that this is the majority opinion. I'm glad that it's not the majority opinion. Would be quite, in my view, it would be giving credit to the slow demise of the European project. But again, you see these differences arising, and you see these conflicts arising, both on a citizen level, but also, as you said, state and federal level.
All right. And we will give Flora the last word in answering Sun Ping.
That's a huge responsibility, having the last word in answering. No, I will talk about mostly the national level, given that Nicholas has spoken about the European level. At the national level, you can find exactly the same kind of dynamic that Nicholas has described as existing in Germany and within the European Union. Again, historical factors are important because even though we have our history, the country reached national unity only in 1861. And there are really strong differences between each one of the 20 regions in the country. And as you can imagine, there are pre-existing tensions, contradictions, enmities, differences in income, in economic development, in industrial structures, everything. And those existing tensions, they have simply been highlighted. That's an effect of the crisis. One of the effects of the crisis highlighting already existing tensions to the north and center, to the north and south. But that's only part of the picture, because in exactly in the same way as some Italian citizens could receive healthcare in Germany, within my country, you had some citizens from Lombardy who could receive healthcare in some of the southern regions. And also in this case, you have the same kind of rhetoric. Why would we southerner bother to cure someone from a northern province? And again, thank God, it was only a part of the public opinion that subscribed to that point of view. So different countries, different histories, different cultures, and yet the same amplifying, a substantial similarity in the effect of the epidemic, that is, emphasizing, highlighting, you know, a lot of the tensions that were already existing even before COVID-19.
Well, thank you very much, Flora, and thank you all. We are coming to the end of the conference roundtable. It has been an exciting 3 hours, at least for me. It's been a long 3 hours, but an exciting 3 hours. The interventions and the comments were actually quite useful and stimulating. The questions even more so. And again, I have many, if not most of the questions that have been posited, that have been posted. I will circulate them to the participants, and we will post both the questions and the answers to the conference website in the coming days. We didn't mean to ignore you, but we didn't want to make this 6 hours. Kill all of us. And so we will respond. We are not ignoring. It's just physically it was impossible. But great questions, great presentations. I'm really proud to have been a small part of this endeavor. I have learned a tremendous amount. I want to thank each and every one of the participants. And I want to thank each and every one of the folks who sat and listened to all of this. Thank you very much. I hope you got something out of it in whatever way that is possible. And maybe we'll do this again sometime. So again, folks, thank you. The conference roundtable has come to a close. And if you've got questions, comments, inputs, please send them. Inputs and other materials from our participants and contributors will be published in the Journal of the Coalition for Peace and Ethics, Emancipating the Mind in the New Era, in a special volume 15, special issue 2, which should be coming out in the next several weeks. So stay tuned for that. And again, thank you very much. And either good night or good morning or good afternoon to all of you.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a
Stay
pleasure.
safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.